As we transition to our review of the Governor's 2012-2013 budget proposals, I'm pleased to note that we are joined today by Michael Cohen of the Department of Finance and Mac Taylor of the Legislative Analyst's Office. Mr. Cohen will present to us an overview of the budget, and Mr. Taylor will provide an initial analysis from the LAO. To avoid repetition, I'm going to ask both panelists to finish speaking before we open it up to member comments and questions. And I'm also going to say, in terms of members' comments and questions, today again is not the day to go through all of the details of the budget. This is sort of the 10,000-foot approach. We're going to look at the overall structure, but we're going to have the most deliberative process in my tenure to go through this budget, where we're going to go through the subcommittee process. We're not jammed by a March vote deadline, and we're going to be able to go through this. So we're going to keep to that idea and try to make this basically an informational hearing to go with the basics. Just before we get started, I wanted to make a couple of opening remarks as well. First, want to thank everyone for last year. We got to this place. Our work was difficult and frustrating, but we did get it done. Last year at this time, we were halfway through our subcommittee process so that we could get to the budget floor in time for a June special election. As we know, that didn't quite work out. We quickly pivoted to a majority vote budget, and we passed it for the first time on-time budget in years. That was followed, of course, by the first veto of a budget in recent state history. Then we reached a majority vote budget agreement that eliminated most of the structural deficit and was chaptered before July 1st, 2011. This year, we actually get to reap the benefits of last year's experience to some extent. For the first time in years, there's no special session to distract us from the main budget process. We have time to conduct a deliberative budget process with the public. And to kick off that process today, my office has released the preliminary review, which is on all of the desks of all of the members and is available to the public, which is a document well over 200 pages in length. It's something that I want to commend the budget team. We're working all weekend getting this thing together, and thank you all for your tireless efforts on that. It's over 200 pages in length, and it describes and discusses and analyzes the issues that are in every area of the budget. So it's a great tool for all of us to have as we go through this process. This year, the budget is really a framework for a great public policy choice, in my perspective. It's going to be put to the voters, this choice. We're going to decide whether they want to pay more taxes to support our state or to pay less and to get less. The governor's budget process proposes two tangible alternatives for voters to consider, and it's our job to consider a vigorous public process for both alternatives, and if appropriate, to improve this framework. Like last year, the work will be relentless and difficult, and I want to thank all of you in advance for your work that you're going to embark upon this year. I also want to make 3 points about the budget process itself. I want to acknowledge that my Vice Chair, Senator Nielsen, with whom I really enjoy working, I take to heart the comments he's made over the last year about improving the budget process itself, especially the transparency, and he spoke to that a little bit earlier. And I believe we need to minimally make all the budget and trailer bills available in print at least 24 hours before a vote is taken, but ideally try to provide much more time for public review. I'm committed to that. Last year, we met this goal with all but a handful of times. We did better than in the 2010 process, where we had bills in print earlier and we heard new proposals that were in committee. But I believe we must continue to improve upon our transparency for critical budget issues to best serve the people of California. I've accepted that we are not going to lose all of the bad habits that we adopted during the Big Five era. We're not going to lose all those habits overnight. But I think we can do more to return the power of this process to the members right here in this room. And to my friends in the administration, I have a simple message. You have a lot of big proposals in this budget, but we won't know all the details of them until we see the trailer bills. They're going to be released tomorrow. And we'll see in the details how much details are available, and we look forward to working with you on them. We need the details as quickly as possible, especially on the major changes, so that we have time to transparently and thoroughly review them in a deliberative process. And finally, I believe we need to modernize our budgeting by developing a plan for performance-based budgeting. We have a sub-6 hearing on this topic later this week, and this has been a very bipartisan approach in terms of going after performance-based budgeting. We had a lot of success bipartisanly last year, and I hope to continue that as we move that process forward. And it will allow us, our efforts, combined with what the governor has put forward, in his executive order last year to develop a realistic and affordable method for going about that process. Members, thank you again for all your service to the committee and to the state of California. I'd like now to ask Senator Nielsen if he has any opening comments, and then we'll move straight to the overviews.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll be very brief. And again, I thank you, and it's a delight to work with you. The significant progress of opening the budget process and improving the integrity so very considerably, and including the members of the Budget Committee, who I feel should be really thankful for the empowerment that has been provided them. And there are some very good positive steps taken in this budget that we would compliment the governor on, and we will aggressively work with him on, like some of the things in terms of the categorical program. But there are many questions related there too. We will be asking those questions. I think I would argue at this point that we still don't feel that tax increases are the answer to California's budget problems. Caps and reserves and other matters certainly are. Structural changes within the budget and the budget process are very critical. And the tax increases, if anything, the developments of the last 2 years have proven that they are not needed. And certainly 5 years' worth are not needed. But that said, let's proceed. We're looking forward to the analysts and finance giving us their reflections today. They are very helpful. We know how hard your people work too, and thank them for us because they labor like our staff in the wee hours of night that we may be better informed and make better decisions. So thank you and your staff.
Thank you. So, Mr. Cohen, if you'd like to begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Vice Chair Michael Cohen with the Department of Finance. I will certainly pass along Senator Nielsen's comment about the hard work. I can attest to that the staff of the Department of Finance put in many long hours, weekends, nights away from their families, and we certainly appreciate that. Today I was going to give you a high-level overview speaking from this handout. So if you turn to page 1, you get a snapshot view of basically where we are with our budget situation today as compared to a year ago. As you can see, we've made substantial progress in reducing the size of the state's budget shortfall. I sat here a year ago talking about $20 billion annual budget problems as far as the eye could see. Today, that problem has been reduced by 3/4 down to less than $5 billion annually. For 2012-13, you see the shortfall, if the legislature and the governor were to do nothing, would be right about $5 billion in terms of spending more than revenues. You add that to just over a $4 billion carry-in deficit, and you end up with a $9.2 billion problem, which is the size of the problem that the Department of Finance is projecting that needs to be closed for the 2012-13 budget. Clearly, a lot of progress has been made in the past year, but the economic recovery continues to be slow, and so more work remains to be done. One good indication of just how slow that recovery is that we won't recover under our current projections the level of jobs in this state that we had pre-recession until 2016. And so because the economy, while improving, continues to struggle, combined with, as we talked about in the morning session, a variety of court cases and delayed federal approval of the cuts that the legislature approved last year, we continue to face that roughly $5 billion annual budget shortfall. So if you turn to page 2 of the handout, you get a broad overview of how the governor proposes to solve the $9.2 billion problem. As was the case last year, the governor is proposing roughly even mix of spending reductions and revenue increases. $4.2 billion in expenditure reductions. Those are highlighted on the next page, so I'll pass over that to talk about revenues. $4.7 billion is assumed in the governor's budget. As you well know, the budget is based upon the assumption that the governor's tax initiative will pass at the November 2012 ballot. That includes temporary taxes on the personal income tax side for the state's highest income earners, as well as a temporary half-cent sales tax increase for 4 years. In addition, the governor's tax measure constitutionally guarantees the realignment package that was adopted in 2011 so that counties know that the revenue source will continue to be there well into the future to back the shift of public safety programs from the state to the local governments. The other category, $1.4 billion, is largely a continuation of the policies that were included in this year's budget. Borrowing to pay our interest cost to the federal government on the unemployment insurance loan, the use of late fees to pay transportation debt service, as well as some extensions of loans that otherwise were expected to be paid back to special funds this year where there is no programmatic demand for them, and so those loans are being extended. So the total of $10.3 billion worth of budget solutions compared to a $9.2 billion problem, subtract the two numbers, and you end up with a $1.1 billion reserve under the governor's budget. Turning to slide 3, this provides a little bit more detail on the $4 billion of expenditure reductions proposed in the governor's budget. Many of these cuts are extremely difficult. We recognize that. As we've gone from tough budget year to tough budget year, the solutions have been getting more and more difficult. But we have tried to approach these spending reductions in a way that we think will improve the provision of services and make the programs work better. And good examples of those are in the first two listed in Health and Human Services. The CalWORKS proposal, while there are grant reductions for a number of recipients, it's also the proposal is focused on a renewed interest in making sure that the CalWORKS program is targeting services to those that are most likely to get back to work. A series of one-time solutions a year at a time and spreading the services too thinly, in our view, has diminished the effectiveness of the CalWORKS program. And so we're proposing to focus the job services to the first 24 months of programs recipients' time on CalWORKS. Those individuals that either use up their time for services or are not meeting work requirements, we would continue to protect the children of those households by transitioning those households into a new child maintenance program and using the CalWORKS program really to tie to federal work participation requirements. In the Medi-Cal program, $842 million of solutions. The largest piece here is focusing on the most expensive cases. Within the Medi-Cal program, 7% of program recipients account for 75% of the costs. The majority of those folks are what are known as dual eligible recipients, those that are eligible for both the Medi-Cal program and the federal Medicare program. And so the proposal here is to better integrate the services for Medicare and Medi-Cal eligible recipients and then share the savings with the federal government. In-home supportive services, this is a similar proposal to one you considered last year in terms of eliminating domestic and related services for those households where there is another individual who can provide those services. In education, largely spared from any program reductions under the governor's budget, there are some adjustments, the $544 million you see based on going to a uniform methodology for how we sort of adjust for the what are known as rebenchings, the programs in and programs out within Proposition 98 over the years. The broad picture on Proposition 98 is that in 2007-8, the state provided $56.6 billion worth of funding. This current year, $47.6 billion. So we've had a dramatic drop-off in Proposition 98 funding from pre-recession levels, and the governor's budget begins to restore funding, proposing $52.5 billion of Proposition 98 funding. the way that we're able to afford to do that is based on the passage of the governor's tax measure. And because the outcome of that won't be known until November, we want to be cautious on how we spend those new dollars. And so we propose eliminating $2.4 billion worth of deferrals, where we basically pay school districts currently 20% of their funding the year after they actually spend it. So we would begin to pay off $2.4 billion of those deferrals. As we talked about this morning, another key piece of the Proposition 98 proposal is moving to a single student formula for funding to provide enhanced local flexibility. And we would provide basically a weighted formula per student, but also reflecting the number of students that are on subsidized lunch programs to reflect those students that have traditionally required additional dollars to serve. The child care proposal is basically integrated with the CalWORKs proposal in that the child care dollars would be more targeted to those households who are meeting federal work participation requirements under the CalWORKs program. In the Cal Grant program, the state's program for financial aid for higher education, this is a program that has been growing extremely fast over the past decade and has been largely spared from cuts in past budgets. So there are $302 million worth of savings proposals here. The two main pieces are reducing the level of grants provided for those students who choose to go to a private university or a private school. In addition, raising the grade point averages of eligibility to get into the program based on basically targeting limited dollars to those students who are most likely to be successful and get their degrees. In the all other reductions, the main proposal here is on the state mandates. Whereas in the past number of years, we've basically gone on a year-to-year basis in terms of suspending mandates. The proposal is to repeal those mandates that time has shown are unnecessary. And so in adopting the governor's mandate proposal, you would reduce spending by $828 million that would be incurred if all of the mandates were reinstated. On page 4 of the handout, you sort of get a long-term view of what the governor's budget would be able to do, assuming the passage of the governor's tax initiative. And that is, as we highlighted last May, the state faces now $33 billion of outstanding budgetary borrowing, and under the governor's proposal, over the next 4 years, we'd basically be able to pay it off completely and get the state back onto sound fiscal footing by no longer having the overhang of the past decade's worth of budget decisions that have basically built up this $33 billion of the wall of debt of budgetary borrowing. Other key aspects of the governor's budget that you'll discover as you work through your subcommittee process is moving government closer to the people. I highlighted the K-12 education flexibility proposal. Another key is the realignment, the continued implementation of realignment that was adopted last year, as well as I mentioned the governor's tax initiative that would constitutionally protect those funding. In addition, continuing the work that the legislature and the governor did last year in making government more efficient. Last year's budget eliminated about 20 entities. This year we're proposing the elimination of or consolidation of about 4 dozen additional entities. In addition, over the last few years, we've obviously spent a lot of our energy focused on the general fund. In the coming weeks and months, you'll see additional proposals on the special fund side to, in those special fund programs, finding additional ways to be more efficient. The governor's budget does include a couple items of note there with making our Office of Technology Services more efficient in the charges that they charge departments, as well as the State Department of General Services. And as the chair noted, making the budget process more efficient. There is the subcommittee hearing on Thursday, so I won't spend too much time talking about it. But the governor did issue an executive order in December that requires the Department of Finance to issue a plan, in essence, to lay out a better way for our budget process to work, and that plan will be coming to you in early March. Finally, on page 5 is basically the alternative absent the additional tax revenues assumed within the governor's budget. So, as I mentioned, the governor's budget puts a priority on protecting education and public safety. In the absence of the tax revenues, we're unable to continue to protect those programs at the levels desired. And so you see $5.4 billion worth of trigger cuts that would go into effect in January of 2013 based on the outcome. If the election is unsuccessful, then these cuts would go into effect. The vast majority of the cuts are in Proposition 98. That's for two reasons. One, the protection of Proposition 98 under the base budget, but also two, that the Proposition 98 formula rises and falls with state revenues. So if you don't have the extra tax revenues provided by the governor's tax measure, then Proposition 98 will fall. The $4.8 billion, to put into a little bit of context, is not being able to pay off that $2.4 billion of deferral. In addition, it's equivalent to about 3 weeks of school. The next largest reductions for University of California and the California State University system, each at $200 million. You'll notice the absence of the universities on the prior page with spending reductions, but in the absence of the governor's tax measure, the university systems would each be targeted for additional cuts. Similar with the courts, $125 million reduction is proposed. That's equivalent to roughly 3 days of closures per month within the court system. And then the remaining reductions really fall into the public safety area, those spots where we protected from additional reductions in the base governor's budget, but in the absence of the revenues, we do propose cuts to CAL FIRE, some flood control activities, fish and game, and so forth. So with that, why don't I stop, and I'll be happy to take questions once Max finished with his comments.
Yeah, as I said, we'd like to hold all questions till both of you have presented. So, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. A few days after the governor's budget came out, my office released our overview of the governor's budget. It's something we do every year. We try to give you our initial reactions, both from kind of a high-level view of the governor's revenue, his economic, his expenditure projections, and outlook over the several years. And we also provide initial reactions on some of the major proposals that are in the budget. Now, given that it's already the end of January, my staff will be putting out over the next 2 to 3 weeks more detailed analyses of these major proposals, particularly in the area of health and social services and in education, where the governor has provided some very substantive, very interesting, very complex proposals with important implications for California citizens. And so we will be putting out those analyses that in some cases will recommend that you adopt aspects of the governor's proposal, modify others. Some cases will recommend that you reject some aspects of his proposals. We will also be offering alternatives in some cases, whereas if you want to depart from the governor in certain ways, you will have other choices to achieve a comparable level of savings. But in any case, obviously my staff will be available to help you in your subcommittee work that will begin shortly. With that, Mr. Chairman, let me just make a few very high-level comments, and then we can open it up to questions. On the fiscal outlook, the administration and Mr. Cohen noted that under all of their assumptions, if you adopted all of their proposals, if you adopt their revenue estimates, they would be in balance over the next several years, and they would have monies available to pay off the so-called wall of debt. And that is true if all of those things come true. Now, as we'll talk about in just a minute, we have some concerns on the revenue estimates. But I think the more important sort of perspective here is that you have made enormous progress, and that light actually you can see at the end of the tunnel. If you do take actions this year, even of just a similar magnitude of what the administration is proposing, obviously it doesn't have to be the same proposals, but if you adopt some ongoing solutions of the general magnitude, you will be in much better position over the next several years. You will be essentially close to being in balance or in balance. And so I think this really is an important year. You still have tough decisions to make. If the governor's tax initiative proposal is on the ballot, obviously voters will have a decision to make in November. But you are close. And I think, as Mr. Cohen mentioned, we are in so much better position than we were even a year ago. So some really important but tough decisions cannot get you a long ways this year. On revenues, we have not done our kind of grounds-up new economic and revenue forecast. We will be presenting that to you towards the end of February, kind of before you start in earnest on your subcommittee hearings. But we did look and compare our November forecast with the administration's new budget forecast. Frankly, we haven't seen all that much change in either the economics or the cash in the several months since we put out our November to change our outlook that much. So as just a point of comparison, the administration's number are several billions of dollars higher than where we were in November. And that's just on sort of our baseline forecast. Then there is, of course, the governor's tax initiative, and we had a difference of opinion on how much that would raise also. Almost all of the differences in our estimates are due to the personal income tax. And almost all of our personal income tax differences relate to high-income earners. So we're talking capital gains, proprietor's income, dividends, interest, things like that. We are concerned that the administration's assumptions regarding capital gains is a bit optimistic. They could be right, but we are concerned with what we've seen on cash flow to date as far as the current year is concerned. I don't think there's anything you need to do about it for now. I'd say wait until at least we come out with our new forecast at the end of February. And you probably are going to want to wait until May when you get all of that new information on what people paid on April 15th. But at this point, I think our view is that there's more downside risk to the administration's numbers right now on revenues. But you can wait until we get some better and more complete information. I think some people have also been bothered by just the fact that the two offices were so far apart on our PIT numbers. I guess I would just alert you that with our current revenue structure, there is just more volatility. We now, the general fund, it relies on the personal income tax for over 60% of its revenue. And if the governor's tax initiative passes, that will even be a higher percentage. And with the volatility in the personal income tax, it's not surprising to me that our offices have differences that are rather large, because that's the single biggest thing where we probably are going to differ. So I think that's maybe more of the norm as you look down the road than as some anomaly that we're experiencing this year. Let me just talk about Prop 98 for a second. You saw the governor's, or Mr. Cohen outlined the governor's plan if the tax measures fail in November. And the governor has basically selected one way to provide for that contingency. And his plan relies very heavily on cuts to schools. It's about 90% of the overall trigger reductions that he's proposing. Clearly, you have choices. You can have other cuts that you include in there. If you think that those that would be experienced by schools are too much, you can include other state departments. Obviously, there's tough choices no matter what you do. That's the governor's plan. You have alternatives to it. In fact, you could even, the governor's taken the approach on the contingency is that we'll budget as if the revenues are there, and then our contingency will be what happens if they're not there. You could take just the opposite approach and say we're just going to budget assuming the revenues are not there, and the contingency will be where we put money if it does come in beginning in November. So you do have choices, and that's really the main point I want to make on that. The fact that he has focused so much of the trigger reductions on schools, though, there's an important implication to this for 12-13. Clearly, if the voters approve the governor's tax measure, schools will be much better off over the next several years. There will be more money, their guarantee will be higher. There's no question about that. 12-13 is somewhat of an awkward year, however. it's going to be very similar for districts as the current year was with the trigger reductions, in that they're not going to know whether voters will approve it or not. And we think that many, if not most districts, will do what they did in the current year. They'll budget based on the worst-case scenario. So if you're thinking that, well, schools are fine in 12-13 because we have the new revenues coming in, that may not be the case, because they will budget based on the program based on revenues that they can expect to have, not on what they might have. So what that means is you need to be very deliberative in devising any contingency plan. And to the extent that you do have cuts that are built in under the triggers to schools, I would urge you to provide as much flexibility to them as possible now while they're building their budgets so that they can cope with that potential $2.5 billion reduction under the governor's proposal. So it's a very difficult situation that you have and that schools have for 12-13. It kind of goes away after that because we would know in advance then of what the revenues that would be available for schools starting with 13-14. With that, Mr. Chairman, let me stop and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I'm going to go around there. I'll let you start, Mr. Nielsen, and then I'll add in. But I just want to, again, say to members what I'd like to make this hearing to make it go more smoothly is for members to ask make one point, ask one question, or two, follow-up type of thing, and then look at me again. I'll put you back on the list rather than having a whole bunch of long individual conversations. I'd like to make it as much of a discussion as possible so that folks can get in and get out, because somebody may ask a very similar question as well, and that'll help keep the discussion moving. So with that, again, I want to thank you both for that overview. We're going to be working a lot on this, and I'll turn it to Mr. Nielsen for the first question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm very pleased to see the governor initiate concern in certain areas, the consolidation, the paying down of the debt, long-term reform, and we have a long way to go because we've not made much progress, and greater sincerity needs to be found in that area. Pension reform, CalWorks, that's great, and mandates. And, Mr. Chairman, I would request a consideration for a hearing specifically assessing the progress of realignment and scoping mandates. What are we really talking about here? What will be our scope of consideration of mandate relief? Those are very important areas, and if we could consider some hearing informational just on the assessing where we're at on the realignment. Newer realignment is being proposed this year in several forms. How much further can we go? What have we learned as we've proceeded? And then where can we go on the mandate area? That's really, really important. And I would suggest a consideration, if we're really sincere about mandates, that the first item would be the repeal of that terrible mechanism linked to the trigger last year, whereby the highest assumption must be accepted by the school districts of the revenue, and that if there be any reductions, they have to be bargained for. That's one of the most egregious mandates, I think, in the last 40 years, and we should start our mandate discussion by repealing that. The only quick question then, for now, then I'll come in later. The volatility, Mr. Taylor, of the revenue, you've spoken an awful lot about that. And I saw a good example of it just this week. A meeting was convened about the Prop 10 from 1998, tobacco tax revenues. They've declined precipitously, and now there's this panic about that. Well, whatever the proponents wanted to accomplish must have worked. Behavior was changed by virtue of that tax increase, if you will, on cigarettes. What are the driving factors for the decisions of individuals, businesses, and corporations, Mr. Taylor, that you see that makes it predictive that, they're not going to make those decisions to spend? Are there some historic examples of the behaviors, or are you just talking about the trends that you've seen in face of when taxes have been imposed?
Well, I'm not sure, Mr. Nielsen, are you talking about just the volatility issue in general, or?
Well, it's up and down, and I think one of the assumptions I make is if you raise those taxes, then, rather than bringing in more revenue, there will be decisions made by those individuals, businesses, and corporations that they're not going to spend and expand and invest that which would bring greater revenue on the natural.
I think that's a piece of volatility, especially if you're talking about raising rates on higher income people. I think maybe I'd be more concerned with the longer term effects of those tax rate decisions. I don't think people are going to kind of up and leave right away because of that. It might change future decisions, though, business decisions in particular. I think on the volatility, what makes it so hard for us as forecasters, and I know Mr. Cohen would agree with me here, is that it's not just a question of trying to predict the economy. You have to predict the behavior of individual taxpayers. And for example, in the case of Facebook, which is getting a lot of attention right now, there's so many things that we would have to factor in and would have to know about before we could estimate how much money the potential IPO of Facebook could result in state revenues. You have to know who's living in California. You have to know what the price of the stock will be, what the lock-in period, when they would sell, how many they would sell. And so that's a rather important factor, though, for revenues. It could be a lot of money in 12-13 or 13-14. And those are not things that we can make reasonable assumptions about. But when you're talking about capital gains income and the income of high-income taxpayers in general, and I think this gets to your point, they have much more control over how they make their tax payments, how they can shift income, decisions they make on where they earn their income. So it's much more difficult for us as forecasters because of how much of our income is at that top end of the scale.
Thank you.
One other housekeeping thing for members. We started this last year. If you have a follow-up question, just shoot me a quick look on that, and I'll try to insert follow-up questions to jump the queue so that we can have more of a discussion-oriented conversation here. But that being said, next is Bonilla, Ms. Bonilla, followed by Mr. Nastande.
I was wondering if you could just go into it. I don't think you did in your summary of the plan of shifting the general obligation bond debt into 98 and then actually proposing programmatic cuts as part of that. What was the rationale? What was behind that thinking, and is it something that is actually possible to accomplish?
Sure, thank you. So our Proposition 98 plan, assuming the passage of the governor's tax measure, is $52.5 billion. And with that plan, we're able to have a balanced budget through 2015-16. The same goal in the absence of the tax revenues was basically driving the trigger decisions, that we want to be able to, if the voters decide not to pass the taxes, to continue to have a balanced budget going into the future. So as you mentioned, one of the ways we would generate general fund savings within Proposition 98 is to move general obligation debt service for K-14 school facilities from outside of the guarantee into the guarantee. We would provide additional funds to help pay for those costs. However, based on the method that these sort of rebenchings occur, basically we would be shifting in about $2.6 billion worth of costs and only providing an additional roughly $200 million worth of money. So there's basically $2.4 billion worth of bond debt service that would have to be paid within the guarantee, and that leads to cuts in other school programs. It's in essence the equivalent of 3 weeks worth of the school year. In terms of the legality, we feel very comfortable in terms of it's the same sort of moving programs into the guarantee and moving out of the guarantee that have been done over the last number of years. It's similar to a proposal we're making for UC and CSU in terms of moving debt service on their facilities within their own budget, so that you sort of see all of the operations and all of the capital costs together. But the Constitution speaks to support for schools that comes from both the operations side and the capital side.
Ms. Buchanan with the follow-up,
Yeah,
and
just
followed
a
by
quick,
Mr. Nastande.
I'd like, Mac, do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah, well, I won't speak to the legal issue. Let me speak to the policy issue. I think that Prop 98, the way it's been conducted and the way it was envisioned, was as an operating budget. And I think there was good reasons why you didn't put debt service in. We didn't have a stream of payments that we made on a consistent basis to schools. We had debt service payments that still go up and down quite a bit. And so I think from a policy basis, I think it made good sense to exclude it, and I still think it makes better sense to exclude it. If we had a very different way of providing for capital outlay as kind of a per pupil tack on, I would say, well, of course, move it in. But there's also, I think, the issue of we've been 25 years now, and I think it's almost just a process issue of the state can just go in 25 years later and say, well, we're going to do it this way. It so happens that it may work in our favor as opposed to yours. And regardless of which way it worked, I just think at some point it raises some more fundamental questions about what does 98 really mean.
Mr. Nestande, followed by Mr. Jesper.
Thank you. And a lot of my questions were on that same issue, the school bond, but on within Prop 98 guarantee, you're also counting on, I think, about $1 billion in the RDA money coming into the schools. You're rebenching, whatever, recalculating, moving the RDA money or that pass through into school districts. Is that correct?
That's correct. Roughly $1 billion a year going into the future.
Now, is that assuming that then that the redevelopment agencies or the oversight committees, whatever, sells all those properties that are currently or that are moving into that process and gets rid of them within the year?
No, that's we haven't made any assumptions regarding the sort of sale off of existing properties. That's our estimate based on the Supreme Court decision that'll on the natural happen and start flowing.
It's just the pass through. It has nothing to do with
it's in addition to the pass through. It's the difference between the level of debt service in existence today that needs to be paid from former redevelopment agencies and the level of what used to be tax increment property taxes. So
are those disputable numbers at all, Mr. Taylor?
Not at this point. I mean, I think we're all flying a little bit blind in knowing what's going to happen, but we think those are reasonable estimates.
Okay, and just a final comment. Look, this is a very tough budget, and there's a lot of things I do like in here, the categoricals and so forth. There's a lot of good pieces, but it truly is a facade on the Prop 98. You're really just about every school district's going to, as we talked about, budget for the worst case scenario. They really have no choice. So you might as well have just budgeted for that up front and then say if taxes pass, then we'll pay off the wall of debt or whatever it might be. But I really think it's not good policy or even close to it by, like I say, having this facade of pretending that they're going to pretend the money's there when they just simply can't do that.
I think it's worth remembering that the governor doesn't want the school cuts to happen. That's why he's proposing the tax measures. So to basically implement the cuts right out of the gate ends up with the complete opposite result of what we're looking for. But certainly it is a challenge for school districts. We understand that, and we're looking forward to working with the schools over the coming months to figure out a way where we can give them as much flexibility as possible to adjust to changing circumstances. But it is a challenge.
That. Just for the shortage of time, sorry to interrupt you, but if he didn't want to do that, then he didn't have to do all this rebenching and move revenues out of the 98 guarantee, the excise tax and these other ones that he's doing. He didn't have to do that. He would have left school districts whole or whatever on the natural. They would have had more money without moving these tax revenues around Prop 98.
If you're referring to the 2011 realignment, it's certainly
well, that's part of it.
We at the end of the day, we have to balance our budget, and so to sort of compare where 98 would have been absent a balanced budget, I don't think it's particularly constructive. We've provided schools as much money as we can while still meeting our constitutional obligation.
I understand
to balance.
it's a tough budget. It's tough but let's not pretend that schools are being made whole here. They are not. They're taking a hit up front. So let's not say everything's good, but then if the triggers come in, then we got a problem. No, he's rebenching, we're redirecting monies, and then you're going to be forced to take these monies out at the front end anyways because you can't function and operate with those triggers. That's all I'm
We're-
saying. is
we're-
Let's just be, we like to say honest budget. Let's just be honest and say they are not going to have those money.
And I don't think the story's written yet, because we do expect in the next several months to continue to work with you as well as school districts to figure out a way to make this work where they're able to budget at a higher level but still have the flexibility in case the voters reject the tax measure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Chesborough, followed by Ms. Harkey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to make a quick point that ties back to this morning's discussion and what's proposed in the budget with regards to the school buses, home to school transportation, and then I have a question about the state responsibility area rural fire fee. We talked this morning about the short-term fix. There in the budget is a proposal, first of all, to combine all K-12 categoricals, which sounds like that would give us the flexibility to deal with the problem, except then it turns around and completely eliminates the $618 million in home-to-school funding. So that's taken off the table, and so that's going to complicate our task. I just wanted to make that point. We didn't really touch on that this morning. The budget makes reference to the administration continuing to evaluate the long-term structure of the rural fire fee, or SRA, state responsibility area fee, and I remain very concerned by the current fee of $150 per habitable structure, with only a $35 reduction in the structure within the current boundaries of local fire agencies that have assessed homeowners' fees. And so homeowners are currently paying for fire service. It seems really inequitable and unfair to charge someone who resides in a one-room cabin or an old mobile home in a low fire risk area the same amount as someone in a $1 million home in a high fire risk area, perhaps with no local fire service. There's just a huge array of potential exposure and expense to the State Department of Forestry, CAL FIRE. But the fees are just a flat fee regardless, and a flat exemption, which the $35 hardly covers what most local people are paying if they've approved local fees. So for that reason, I'm planning to introduce a bill to try to create specific criteria to try to address this. But I wondered to what degree, I know the Board of Forestry has been wrestling with this, but to what degree the Department of Finance is analyzing it, like this morning's discussion, not from the standpoint of reducing the overall budgetary benefit of charging the fee, and I understand that, but rather trying to figure out how to do it in a way that is less inequitable, because you can be someplace where it rains 60 inches a year and there hasn't been a forest fire in 100 years, and living in a one-room cabin and you're paying the same amount as somebody in a high fire-prone chaparral area and in a home that is worth vastly more value.
So the governor's budget does assume the implementation of the law that was passed by the legislature last year, and is not at this point proposing any additional changes. As you'll recall, at the end of session last year, we had proposed a series of modifications to the law. Those didn't pass, and so at this point we're going forward with the law that is in effect. But certainly we're always willing to have discussions about alternatives and changes, but the fee was adopted as a budget balancing tool, and so that's certainly from our department's perspective going to be the number one driver.
Well, the bill proposal at the end of the session last year would have actually made the inequities worse, so I hope the administration will work with me to try to figure out how to take what is a very difficult idea to start with, but we're in a difficult environment, and work towards trying to somehow adjust it so that it is applied in a less inequitable way.
Sure, I'll look forward to seeing the details of that.
Okay, Mr. Nielsen with a follow-up, and then Ms. Harkey.
Briefly on that point, I have to tell you that you said that that was defeated. Yes, it was defeated. But then the Board of Forestry went ahead and implemented by regulation that which largely that which we defeated. That's not keeping good faith with the legislature, and let's just say we take some offense. And I do predict a citizen tsunami when those tax bills come out. All these members are really going to have some fires lit, and it's not going to be fires around those houses. It's going to be fires here.
Ms. Harkey, followed by Mr. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. I refer you to page 4 of your handout. The first question I have is pretty basic. I have three of them on this. One is, what forces the debt reduction? Do we have a spending limit in place?
The debt reduction proposal is the governor's proposal, and it's his commitment to reduce the debt. There is also Proposition 58 in place that, absent a governor's executive order, requires 3% of state revenues to be put into a special reserve. Half of that money is then used to make a supplemental payment on the economic recovery bonds. So once we sort of achieve fiscal balance and sort of restore our fiscal house, there is Proposition 58 in place that acts as a tool both to save additional money as well as make supplemental debt payments.
Those recovery bonds are roughly about, I think, $8 billion at this point, because we've been reducing them since 2004, 2003, 2004. What constitutes the $33 billion in budgetary borrowing? 8 is are the 2004 bonds.
Sure. One of the main pieces of that is the school deferrals that.
About $10 billion?
About $10 billion. Economic recovery bonds, we've got about $6.3 billion outstanding. Loans from special funds, just over $3 billion. Mandate costs, both for Proposition 98 mandates, are $3.5 billion, as well as the non-98 ones are close to $1 billion. We've got the $2 billion of local government borrowing that was done in 2009 that'll be paid off in 2012-13 as well. And then the other pieces start getting a little bit smaller. Medi-Cal deferrals, state payroll deferrals, and deferrals to CalPERS are the remaining
thank you.
pieces.
We're on the same page.
Yeah,
I had
and I
close
just
to $35 billion. So my next question is just a follow-on. So this does not include the $10 billion in unemployment insurance that is behind?
That's correct. These are really sort of general fund obligations, whereas the general fund is on the hook for the interest there. The $10 billion unemployment insurance is kind of a separate liability in addition to our pension unfunded liabilities, retiree health unfunded liabilities. Certainly all of those other costs are out there that we highlighted in the last May revision.
Okay, in the governor's budget, he has $473 billion or something like that. He's taxing existing employers to make up the interest payment on this.
On the unemployment insurance, there is a surcharge to on employers, yes, proposed to cover the interest costs.
Thank you. My numbers are correct.
And also, I just want to point out, Zarki and everyone else, on the document that I put together for you in terms of the analysis of the budget, on page 9 of that, we have a table which basically is verbatim of what Mr. Cohen said. It outlines the wall of debt pay down estimates.
Right.
So
I have the wall of debt. I have that on a graph, and I've had it around this office for probably 3 years. It's been about $35 billion, give or take. And so we additionally have $91 billion in general obligation debt as well. So I think we need to make note that it's not just this. This is cash flow kind of structural deficit that's been accumulating over probably close to the last 10 years. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Wagner, followed by Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I understand that in this proposal, the governor is assuming the tax revenues from his initiative pass, and that's folded in here. Let me pick up on something you mentioned just a minute ago, Mr. Cohen. A couple of months ago, the governor put forth a 12-point pension reform plan. Does that plan realize any savings in the 2012-2013 budget? Are those folded into here? And as a follow-up, is there a time frame the governor is looking at to actually get pension proposals to the legislature for us to deal with?
Well, your last point, I mean, in terms of the 12-point plan that has been presented to the legislature, the Joint Committee has been holding its hearings and discussing those particular provisions. In terms of budget impact, there is not a direct, immediate general fund impact from the new proposals. I think where you would find pension reform savings are really things that the governor and the legislature have already adopted. So over the last couple of years, new employees are now at a rolled back pension benefit for new hires, and those savings have been folded into and will be folded into CalPERS's rates. In addition, state employees are now paying 3 to 5% more out of their paycheck towards pension costs. Those have been built into the budget. So it's the continuation of past pension reform efforts that are really kind of the immediate budgetary benefit. The governor's 12-point plan is really about the long term, and when you talk about pensions, you end up talking about decades down the road. As new employees are hired, it takes many years for them to sort of fully be folded into the system and for all of the savings to be reflected.
Understood. Thank you.
Ms. Brownlee, followed by Ms. Bonilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to ask, this question keeps coming up, and lots of questions in my office around this. This is about transitional kindergarten, and you're scoring, I think, somewhere like $225 million of savings for transitional kindergarten. So where are you coming up with that number? Does that mean the elimination of all transitional kindergarten? Is that... I'm just not understanding where the number's coming from.
Sure, and why don't I, when we were over in the Senate, Senator Simitian had questions along the same lines, and we committed for next week to get him sort of a detailed analysis of our savings estimate. I'll plan on just sharing that with this committee as well, so that you can sort of walk through how we come up with our savings estimate.
Okay, and just one follow-up question on this. So I think this is what districts are most interested in, is whether, districts who are already providing transitional kindergarten or districts who are having children, in essence, really do kindergarten twice. We're not calling it transitional kindergarten necessarily. Are you going to be, is part of your proposal to continue to pay the ADA to those school districts?
In essence, we would be not requiring districts to provide the transitional kindergarten, but allow them to continue to do as they have. But why don't I just wait for the, sort of the breakdown of the savings estimate until we pull it together and share it with you next week.
Okay.
As luck would have it.
Ms. Bonilla, followed by myself.
My question's along the same lines. I guess the LAO mentioned this concern, and we're already seeing it happen. And I appreciate the fact that you're going to get us the information next week. Unfortunately, there's already effects happening because of the budget's release. We saw in the newspaper that San Francisco Unified has decided they're just going to cancel transitional kindergarten. They're not going to do it. And that's a really grave concern. For one thing, it's the law, and the legislature passed that law. And I think we certainly expect our school districts to be implementing it, and we want to continue along that path. It's probably the single bright spot in education in the last number of years. And there's been a tremendous investment already in a number of districts as well. So I guess you don't have the specific answers that we really need. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to disseminate them very quickly to the public. And then also, I guess my question is that if maybe I'll just let the LAO speak on the issue of, do you feel that the savings are realistic? Mr. Taylor, and then you've already spoken to the issue of the uncertainty and the disruption, frankly, that is caused by this. And I'm just disappointed that it's been rolled out to cause, such a negative impact, really, on a program that has such tremendous potential.
Well, let me just step back a little bit and explain why we're proposing to eliminate the requirement, and that's basically the notion that as we're making all of these very difficult cuts, the governor didn't feel it was appropriate to start up new programs, expand new programs, and so forth. So in terms of districts kind of reacting to governor's proposals, clearly a governor's budget is not the power of a law change. So, but I think it's an issue that's constantly coming up, that districts, counties, cities are forced to sort of react and position themselves for potential changes, but they obviously have to continue to follow the law as well. So it is, I think, just a difficult reality of when we're in years where we do have such large budget problems that we're kind of constantly changing the rules on.
But let me interject that while if the governor was not interested in changes, then perhaps the date rollback should have been one of the changes that he also wasn't interested in, because the effect of that is going to be putting children out of kindergarten. So that's a change, and it's going to cause disruption. So we need to be consistent with our line of reasoning, in the actions that we're taking.
I think you'll see throughout the budget that the governor is certainly not afraid of major changes, and the time when there's the public debate on the magnitude of those changes does certainly create some uncertainty, and there's not much we can do about that.
Well, we could keep debating that, yes.
Just 3 quick points, Assemblymember Bonilla. We think the savings is realistic from what we've seen so far, that you can get the $224 million. It's in revenue limit savings. This is one of those things, if you were to decide that you had to make this change and went along with the governor, obviously the sooner that you made it, the better, so that at least families would know of the change. So that's just one more consideration for you. Finally, though, you should also consider other related proposals. For example, the governor's proposing certain reductions in preschool program. Maybe that you may feel that this is one that you have to do on the transitional, the TK program, but maybe there's things you want to do on preschool that could help cushion the blow. You might want to consider some short-term priority for those kids, especially low-income kids who were caught in the middle of this, at least for a year or two. So I think there are at least other things that you can take into account as you consider the governor's proposal.
Yeah, I have a question followed by Mr. Nielsen. And it's for the Department of Finance. It's less about the details and more about sort of the vision and regarding education. As we move government closer to the people and we get rid of categoricals, and what is the vision for the state's role in education? Ultimately, is the vision to just be a pass-through agent? Are we looking at maintaining uniformity, or what level of oversight? If you could just sort of speak to the goal here.
Sure. Broadly, the goal is to have more decision making and more authority back at the local school and local school district levels, so that clearly does come with some distancing from the state of being involved in lots of decisions that we've become accustomed to being involved with. So I think our primary purpose, as set out in the Constitution, is the funder of schools. And under the governor's proposal, you really see a vision of restoring that the funding that's been cut over the last few years, and giving school districts the flexibility to figure out what the best way to improve education and sort of a comfort level with different districts taking different tacks in educating the state students.
But that's the vision, basically, to get us back to just that primary role and not have the other roles.
Certainly, there's an interest in overall accountability, but some of that accountability should take place at the local level, and it's more setting up a state structure to ensure that local voters and local parents can hold their local schools accountable.
Thank you. Mr. Nielsen, followed by Mr. Chesbrough.
Mr. Cohen, the original proposal was about 5 years of about $7.35 billion. Now, consistent to the point made earlier about those who are being taxed making decisions, you've revised that down about $31 billion. For 5 years, what do we have that could comfort us that that revenue would really be used to get our budget under control in a sustaining and long-term way, not just used to restore funding, elevate the base of other programs, and increase spending? What can you give us any assurance of?
Number one is the governor's commitment to reduce the level of debt. That, combined with the constitutional obligation to, as revenues go up, to provide schools more money, are really the driving factors in our multi-year outlook. It's paying down debt and providing schools what is owed to them under the Constitution. The level of the wall of debt, some of it gets paid off on the natural. Others will require decisions that school districts should be given a budget that reflects the actual program that they can afford to run in a particular year, and that's paying off that $10 billion worth of deferrals.
Well, the governor will have to be like Horatius at the bridge then, because there are going to be folks here that want to spend that on other things, I trust. So there will be a tussle. We can't oblige a future legislature, so it at least is a little bit risky, is it not?
Certainly, every legislature is going to make different budget decisions. That's the system we have set up. It's a temporary tax proposal to basically get our fiscal house back in order and create some stability within the state.
I just would rhetorically observe, though, voters do have to get skeptical. This is a 2-year tax increase that became a 5, that remains a 5 more, so a total of 7. That's been hanging around about 5 years now over the heads of the citizens, and they're not seeing anything temporary about that, I think. It's just a rhetorical point, but I think it is an issue we have to take account of. Thank you, Mr. Cohen.
Ms. Brownlee with a follow-up, and then Mr. Wagner.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up a little bit on the school finance and the categoricals and the weighted student formula. I think, obviously, by the concept of pushing that down to the local level will provide accountability at the local level, perhaps better accountability at the local level, but I think we're going to have to also develop some accountability measures for the state and the legislature as well. I think that's just, it's got to happen that way. But I wanted to ask, just on the weighted piece in the proposal, that it's my understanding is that the governor's proposal is based on the Michael Kurse, Goodwin Lewin, Alan Burson, Stanford study, which, and that's all good, and I personally like that. I guess my question is, in that particular study, they were inferring the whole district's harmless, at least at the outset on that weighted piece, but it seems as though, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as though the governor's proposal, at least what I have understood so far, is that there is no hold harmless piece.
We're in a situation where if the governor's tax measure passes, schools will be receiving increases in funding over the next 5 years, and so that'll provide much of the room to basically so that no districts would be would be losing much, if anything. But it is a 5-year phase in of the formula, and we'll have more details for you tomorrow with the trailer bill language.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob.
No problem. Mr. Wagner, followed by Mr. Chesborough.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to follow up on that, if the taxes are passed, the schools are going to get this 5-year phase-in. But I understood Mr. Taylor to say that, given the current situation, schools will have to budget for 12-13 as if the revenues are not there. Did I understand you right? Can you tell me why?
Well, because if they're not there, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to make mid-year reductions.
Okay. Shouldn't the legislature, under the same principles and for the same reasons, also budget the same way?
Well, help me out, Mr. Nestan. Again, I think that's what I tried to point to, that you have two different ways you can do this, and they have different levels of certainty. They have different outcomes at the local level. There's different pressures on whether the state makes decisions or whether you want locals' decisions to make. You want the locals to make the decisions. And it's kind of a balancing act for you. But I think what we at core we wanted to raise is that there were a lot of people who were just assuming that if the voters approved this, or because it was out there, that schools were okay for 12-13, and they're not.
Thank you. Mr. Chesborough, followed by Mr. Nestande.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One major change in the CalWORKS budget that's proposed is to no longer make a parent eligible for child care services if they're attending college, while they're attending college. And without the vast majority of children who are attending community college child care centers, the whole educational component at the community colleges is likely to go away, because the practicum of the child development labs is dependent on having that population of people eligible for child care. So I guess this is an example of collateral damage, if you will. To what degree, either the LAO or the Department of Finance, are you analyzing the ripples, the effects that perhaps are unintended, but will in fact bring down other consequences, such as this?
Sure. Certainly, we tried our best in building the budget to view all the interrelated programs as interrelated and in a unified system. So whereas I think in past years you might have seen the CalWORKS proposal and the child care proposal very sort of disparate and try to figure out how they fit together, we did do our best to really drive both program proposals to the same end goal of taking limited dollars and targeting them to those folks meeting federal work participation requirements. There's certainly going to be unintended consequences of many proposals, and it's really a matter of trying to think through them as much as possible. And when you work through your deliberations, we'll be happy to evaluate them, whether or not we think the effects are likely, and to sort of, if they are likely, well, how widespread it would be. And so we'll look forward to doing that throughout the spring.
Okay, well, I only mentioned the secondary consequence. I didn't focus in on the primary consequence of taking someone who's going to college and presumably becoming more self-sufficient, losing their ability to do so because they lose child care. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Nestande, followed by Ms. Bonilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Cohen, if I didn't mention before, I think you're doing a great job up here. It's a tough hot seat to be sitting in. But on the budget assumptions, it seems a lot of these changes and tax proposals and so on are coming down to really the difference in your revenue assumptions between the LAO and finance. I know, as you said before, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge difference, but it's a delta of about $4 billion, I think, or close to it. Is there any way, and Mr. Mack, I think you alluded to in your report about they may assume some type of behaviors on taxpayers, such as the tax expiring, the 2002 federal tax cuts expiring, therefore selling off their whatever assets they have to get to capital gains 2012. Do you guys, is there any way for you to reconcile your assumptions, or is that just you're walled off and do separate things?
No, both of our offices have been spending a lot of time together to figure out what our differences are and why, and certainly an assumption on federal tax policy is something we have been able to isolate. That accounts for about $1.5 billion worth of the difference in our 12-13 forecast. But ultimately, you are left with it's exceedingly difficult right now to do revenue forecasting, both due to the uncertainty of the economic recovery as well as the federal government sort of debating very large potential changes in their own budget and their own fiscal policy. So combining the general economic recovery with federal tax policy that can change individuals' behavior, it just makes forecasting right now uncertain. But on that particular policy change, we were able to. It accounts for about $1.5 billion.
And before, and I'm sorry, I said Mr. Mac Taylor. Before I allow you to respond, can you talk about? I think you mentioned also the pitfall, potential pitfall of, the Facebook effect, whatever it might be. Of those are one-time revenues, as we all know, and counting on a budget going out beyond this year is very dangerous with those one-time revenues. But if you could talk about the reconciling of the two, appreciate it.
Sure. I think as Michael said, when we come out in our February forecast, I think we're going to make a point of giving you an apples-to-apples difference, so that if we made different assumptions about what the federal tax rates would be, we'll say, well, here's the numbers on a comparable basis with finance, so we can then focus on the true underlying differences associated with that. So I think we'll at least try to do that. And we're talking all the time to make sure that we don't have unnecessary differences between our forecasts. But it does come down to this is a highly variable forecast. The uncertainty around either of our forecasts are billions of dollars, plus or minus. And I think people might think, well, if we'd come out with close to the same number, well, there's nothing to worry about. Well, no, that would kind of mask the underlying uncertainty that is still there. And it's just because people have so much, high-income taxpayers have so much discretion on the way that they manage their tax affairs. So, we're doing our best. I think we have very good relations with the Department of Finance, and we'll try to minimize differences that don't need to be there. But fundamentally, we're always going to have forecasting differences both on our economics and on the way we do our revenue forecasts.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up, and I mean, you and I had a number of conversations, and I was struck by all of the variables that go into that forecast. And maybe you could outline some of those that is akin to our conversation a number of weeks ago, in terms of the information that you're getting from New York and the different inputs. I was astonished by all the different things that are going in. If you could outline some of those for everyone's benefit.
Well, sure. Even on the economic side, obviously you have to factor in what are the feds doing with their various assumptions on the Budget Control Act that was passed, on the sequestration process, whether they extend their, the Social Security tax rate cuts for 2 months, 12 months. You have their the tax rates, will they be extended or not? I mean, you just have this whole, as Mr. Cohen mentioned, this whole array of decisions at the federal level on both the revenue and the expenditure side that could substantially change our revenue forecast, let alone our budgetary forecast of the amount of monies that might be provided to us under our education and health and social service programs. And then on revenues, even if you hit the economy right, you have to kind of figure out, well, what's the distribution of that income by income groups, particularly those higher income groups who are paying at the high marginal tax rates. And you have to kind of forecast, well, how are they going to be claiming their income? When are they going to be claiming their capital gains? You have to kind of have your hand or, your pulse on the housing markets and the capital markets, and makes your best judgment about where are those markets going 12, 18 months in the future. And then if you hit that right, there are so many behavioral things about the way people claim their tax losses and tax gains, you still could be considerably off. So, we do our best, but I can assure you that revenue forecasting now, as compared when I joined the office decades ago now, is so much more difficult. It used to be that if you could call the economy, you could basically call revenues, and that's just not the case now.
And with what we've done in terms of net operating loss and the changes, as you mentioned, we don't have the historical data to show us accurate trends because we've just changed the rules in the last couple of years.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I didn't raise those issues, both changes that we've made. And NOLs is a great example of that. There's a huge backlog of NOLs and on research and development credits, unclaimed credits. And it makes doing the corporate tax very difficult also.
Right. Which I guess also means that probably as the economy improves and the lag that we might see in terms of state revenues may also be a little bit longer than we've traditionally seen. Is that correct?
I think that's fair, that those outstanding credits could dampen the growth in the corporate tax from what you otherwise think should be occurring.
Yeah, or historically would occur, you know. Okay. Ms. Bonilla, followed by Mr. Dickinson.
Just a quick question around the governor's initiative and any contingency plans or what the administration's thinking. We know there may be more than one initiative on the ballot. Do you have plans in the case that the governor's initiative might fail and another one would pass? What are your thoughts around that?
Our budget is based on the mechanics of the governor's tax measure. Certainly there are a lot of other initiatives that our offices have analyzed in recent weeks, but most of those other ones don't have the same budget interactions as ours, so that you may have a measure raising a similar amount of money, but if it's not able to help balance the budget, then it's not going to have the same effect. So the short answer is the governor's budget assumes the trigger based on the passage of the governor's tax measure. If it passes, then the budget stays as is. If the governor's tax measure fails, then the trigger cuts go into effect.
Just the final topic I wanted to touch on was the Cal Grant. What was your thought behind that?
Largely, it's a matter of looking at the state's fastest growing programs and where we can have the flexibility to make reductions. That the Cal Grant program has been a double-digit annual increase program over the last decade or so, and it has not had many cuts made, so that in essence we felt that we were able to propose $300 million worth of cuts without fundamentally altering the basic commitment that those students who go to public university and are meeting a slightly higher grade point average wouldn't be affected at all by the proposal.
Well, I look forward to our discussions in committee on that topic as well.
Thank you. Mr. Dickinson, followed by me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow on from something Mr. Chesbro raised in a sense. Obviously, all budget decisions aren't just about dollars; they're ultimately about the impacts on people, for better or worse. And in looking at the administration's CalWORKs proposal, for example, the estimate is that over 131,000 cases will move to this new so-called child maintenance program by roughly April of next year, meaning the adults will, if I understand this correctly, not get any support. My question is a predicate to a much larger question is there any reason why those people would not be eligible for county general assistance?
Right now, many of those adults aren't receiving aid already. It's really the grant reduction to the children, and there is a sizable grant reduction. In building our CalWORKs proposal, as I said, we were really interested in focusing limited dollars to those people that could meet federal work requirements, and we think it makes sense to have a differential as an incentive for those working and those not. But the size of the grant reduction in the child maintenance program ultimately did come down to dollars and cents and making the budget balance. But the overall framework of the CalWORKs program, we approached from a programmatic perspective of trying to improve the operations of the program, but ultimately the level of the grants was something that depended on.
But there are those adults who currently qualify to receive support because they are in recognized work activities and have remaining eligibility up to 48 months, and the proposal is to take that down to 24 months and make it, if I understand it, retroactive.
In terms of their timing, yes, that if they've already received 24 months worth of services, they would not be eligible for additional services.
So whether it's 131,000 cases or something less than that, there are people adults who have been and would, if nothing changed, continue to be eligible for support through CalWORKs who will not be, right?
That certainly over time there will be individuals who would have been eligible for grants that would no longer be, yes.
So those people would be eligible for county general assistance then?
Someone will come up and correct me, I'm sure, if I get this wrong, but basically those folks have been exempted from GA eligibility.
Well, if they're getting CalWORKs, they may not be. But if they're not getting anything, then, and if they're not ABODs, they at least unless there's information to the contrary, be eligible for general assistance. But without debating the point, my question is there anyone, and this is Mac for you as well, is there anyone who's going to give us some analysis of what the cost shifts or costs of making these cuts are that result from the fact that we make these cuts? Because whether it's in homeless programs or general assistance or in other ways, these people who suffer losses of this kind of assistance don't vaporize. They become costs in different ways to other levels of government or other institutions. We never seem to talk much about that. We worry a lot about millionaires leaving the state, but we don't seem to ever try to quantify the impacts, the costs to other levels of government or to individuals from the loss of support that may mean the difference between having a roof or not, or having a meal or not. And I'm just curious whether that's an area that we might get some analysis of as we go forward in the spring.
We'll certainly try to help you with some of those issues because cost shifts are an important concern, and we do try to take those into account. Sometimes they're harder to quantify, but we'll try to help you in whatever ways we can.
And Assembly Member, let me have Nick Buchan here give you a little bit more precise answer on your GA question.
So you're correct that some of the cases where the adult was being aided will now the adult will no longer be eligible. For those cases, if they still maintain eligibility for what is now a new child maintenance program, they will not be eligible for GA because they'll still be aided by child maintenance. So really it's the because, as Mr. Cohen spoke to, a grant reduction associated with child maintenance, some of those cases will no longer be income eligible for child maintenance. It's those cases that potentially would be eligible for general assistance at the county level.
Okay, so they'll just lose whatever grant the adult's getting and go from $638 to $375 a month for the child, per child. That's all.
That's correct.
Gee, right. Lovely. Thanks.
Cost shift.
I think clearly there's going to be a lot of interest, echoing Mr. Dickinson, in terms of cost shifting and looking at that, and that's going to be one of the questions that's going to penetrate all the subcommittee hearings, is that when we drill down on the numbers, what is the actual number, and then what might we be missing? And so we look forward to working with you on that. I had a question a little more narrow than my previous ones, in terms of, the budget accelerates the movement of the counties into the managed care system for long-term care. And I know we've had a pilot that's dealt with 4 counties so far. And I'm wondering if, and the budget proposes a major acceleration to go from 4 to basically all the counties in a period of years, to 10 and then to 30 and then everyone. The question is, have we had enough data to make that move, or are we operating on faith and what's or somewhere in between? Where's the line on that?
I'm certainly happy to respond. I think that's a very good question, Mr. Chairman. Something that we're looking at. Again, this is a proposal that mainly has implications for 13-14, so I think you have some time. And I think those are exactly the kind of questions that you're going to have to answer. I'm not sure we have enough information, and so maybe that a more partial approach into the governor's plan might be more appropriate. Those are the kind of things that we'll be offering to you when we come out with our pieces in the coming weeks.
Mr. Stande.
Thank you. And I think we haven't actually started a pilot of the 4 counties, right?
Yeah, it may be that we haven't.
But we haven't actually started that.
I think that's correct, actually, Mr. Stande.
And if I may, just to that point, to pipe in on that process of contracting with entities to move them into managed care and so forth in these pilot projects to move what they call dual eligibles, dual for Medicare and Medi-Cal. What we're missing on that is the federal direction of health care is in some cases to contract directly with medical groups to see is there a cost savings with contracting directly with medical groups as opposed to an insurance company. And so far in the state process, we have chosen not to try that, which I think is a mistake. The point of a pilot program is to try something different, have competing ideas, see which one saves the most money. And it seems to me we're missing that for some reason and not at least attempting to contract directly with the medical groups and see if there's a cost savings there. Thank you.
Seeing no further questions or comments, let me just again thank both of our witnesses for you being on the hot seat today and knowing that this is just the beginning of the hot seat, but we hope that it's going to be a collaboration with you, and we're going to work. I think everyone here on both sides of the aisle, from up and down the state, is really committed to trying to do what's in the best interest of the state, and we all have different ideas of how to make that happen. But working together, we'll figure it out. I mean, we as we talked about at the beginning of this, we got rid of 75% of the structural deficit last year. We have a little bit of a ways to go, and we have a lot to be concerned about in terms of impacts and across the board. But I'm confident that this is a group that can handle it, and that we're gonna move forward in a positive way. So thank you very much, and this hearing is over.